Monday mornings in Washington, D.C., were a battlefield. Karoline Leavitt had barely taken a sip of her coffee when her assistant, Michael Carter, walked in, a deep frown etched across his face. "You need to see this," he said, handing her a thick envelope. Karoline set down her mug and took the letter. Noticing the weight of the paper, the federal seal stamped across the top, United States District Court, but something was off. She slit the envelope open with practiced precision, pulling out a neatly folded document. As her eyes scanned the bolded text at the top, a chill ran down her spine. Notice of summons, class action lawsuit. Karoline exhaled slowly. She had been sued before. Politics was a dirty game, but this? She read further. The lawsuit named her as a co-defendant in a class action case against the federal government. The accusation? Obstructing a newly proposed Religious Expression Act, a piece of legislation designed to restrict religious symbols and practices in public institutions. Michael leaned against the desk. "Ever heard of this court?" Karoline shook her head. "No, that's the first red flag." The wording in the lawsuit was deliberately vague. It didn't accuse her of breaking the law. It accused her of influencing public opposition to the bill. A case built on perception, not facts. Her fingers tapped against the desk. "This isn't about winning in court. This is about making an example out of me." Michael nodded grimly. "They want to drag you through the mud, tie you up in legal battles, and send a message." Karoline let out a slow breath. A warning. For years, she had been a thorn in the side of the establishment. Now, they were using the courts as a weapon, twisting the law to silence dissent. She looked down at the document again, eyes narrowing. "Fine," she murmured. "If they want a fight." She tossed the summons onto her desk, reaching for her phone. "Let's give them one." Stepping into the minefield, the federal courthouse loomed ahead, its towering columns casting long shadows under the morning sun. Yet, something was wrong. Karoline Leavitt had expected chaos, reporters shoving microphones in her face, cameras flashing, protesters lined along the steps. But as her SUV pulled up to the curb, there was nothing. No press, no media presence, just an unsettling quiet. Michael Carter, seated beside her, tapped on his phone. "There's not a single mention of this in the morning news cycle." Karoline frowned. A lawsuit this big, with her name attached, should have been headline news. Yet, it was as if the world didn't even know this case existed. "Someone's keeping this quiet on purpose," she murmured, stepping out of the car. She strode up the marble steps, pushing through the heavy courthouse doors. The inside was just as eerie, dim lighting, hushed whispers, the sterile scent of polished wood and old paper. Then she reached the courtroom. Rows of people sat in the gallery, witnesses, supposedly, but as Karoline scanned their faces, she saw the same confusion in each one. Some whispered among themselves, others sat stiffly, darting nervous glances toward the front of the room. None of them looked like they understood why they were here. Karoline's fingers curled slightly. A setup. Then, her gaze landed on the bench, and she saw him. Judge Victor Langston, a name she knew too well. A man notorious for ruling against religious freedom cases. He had been accused multiple times of bias, of deliberately obstructing cases that protected faith-based rights. Yet, every attempt to remove him had failed. Now, he was here, presiding over her case. Langston adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. But Karoline caught the flicker of something behind his eyes, a silent message. "You don't belong here, and you will not win." She exhaled slowly, stepping forward. She had walked into a battlefield where the rules had already been set against her. But they had made one mistake. They thought she would play by them. The game of the powerful. Judge Victor Langston adjusted his glasses, his cold gaze sweeping over the courtroom before settling on Karoline Leavitt. His voice was measured, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of control. "Miss Leavitt," he began, "you stand accused of aiding extremist organizations through your rhetoric and influence, directly interfering with government efforts to regulate religious expression." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Karoline remained still, her expression unreadable. She expected an attack, but this was blatant. Langston continued, flipping through a file. "Your public statements, particularly your opposition to the Religious Expression Act, have been flagged as inciting unrest." Karoline arched a brow. Defending constitutional rights is now considered extremist activity? Langston ignored the question. Instead, he turned to the prosecution's table, where a stiff-looking government attorney stood. "Present the evidence," Langston ordered. The prosecutor nodded and lifted a stack of papers. "We have multiple sources confirming Ms. Leavitt's involvement in radical networks seeking to undermine government policies." Karoline leaned forward slightly. "Let's see the sources." The prosecutor hesitated, flipping through the pages. "These documents reference intelligence reports," he said quickly. "But for security reasons, we cannot disclose their origin." Karoline let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "So, let me get this straight. I'm being accused of conspiring with extremists based on evidence that no one is allowed to see?" Langston shot her a warning look. "Watch your tone, Miss Leavitt." Karoline met his gaze, unwavering. "You'll have to forgive me, Your Honor. I have a habit of questioning things that don't make sense." Langston's jaw tightened. "The witness testimonies will clarify any doubt." The first witness was called. A middle-aged man took the stand, shifting uncomfortably as he glanced around the room. "Do you recognize Miss Leavitt?" the prosecutor asked. The man hesitated. I've seen her speak on television." "And do you believe her statements have encouraged defiance against federal policies?" The man swallowed hard. "Well, I guess some people might take it that way." Karoline narrowed her eyes. This was absurd. The second witness was even worse. A woman who admitted she had never actually met Karoline but claimed that her words had influence. This wasn't testimony. This was a show trial. Then, something even stranger happened. Michael, seated behind her, slipped her a note. She unfolded it discreetly. "This case isn't listed in any federal records." Karoline's pulse quickened. A secret trial. A hidden case. Evidence that didn't exist. This wasn't just a legal attack. It was a game played by the powerful. And they didn't think she could win. Big mistake. The reverse game. Karoline Leavitt sat perfectly still, absorbing every detail of the circus unfolding before her. This wasn't a trial. It was a carefully orchestrated takedown. A political purge disguised as due process. Langston wasn't acting as a judge. He was acting as an executioner. Fine. If they wanted a show, she would give them one. She reached into her blazer pocket and, with a subtle movement, pressed the record button on her phone. The device, placed face down on the defense table, began silently capturing every word, every falsified claim, every manipulation of the law. Then, she leaned forward, locking eyes with Judge Langston. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, "I have a few questions before we proceed." Langston gave a slow, measured blink. "You are not in a position to question this court, Miss Leavitt." She smiled. "I believe I am." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. "Proceed," he said tightly. Karoline stood, slowly pacing in front of the courtroom, letting the silence build before she spoke. "You claim that I'm aiding extremist organizations," she began, her voice even, "but you have provided no verifiable sources, no official reports, and no classified briefings that confirm this. So, tell me, Your Honor, do you have access to these so-called intelligence reports?" Langston hesitated. "The prosecution has presented sufficient evidence." "No," Karoline interrupted, turning fully to face him. "They claim to have evidence. That's not the same thing." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Langston's expression darkened. Karoline stepped closer to the bench. "And let's talk about this courtroom. Why is this trial not listed in any federal records? Why has the media been kept in the dark?" Langston's fingers twitched slightly before he folded them together. "This case is classified due to its sensitive nature." Karoline smirked. "How convenient." Michael, seated behind her, scribbled a note and discreetly slid it onto her desk. "Live feeds are down. No public broadcast. They were trying to contain this. Keep it buried." Karoline took another step closer. "Tell me, Your Honor, are you following the law? Or are you following orders?" Langston stiffened. "You are dangerously close to contempt. Miss Leavitt." She tilted her head. "Wouldn't be the first time someone tried to silence me." The tension in the room thickened. Karoline knew she was pressing into dangerous territory. But that was exactly where she needed to be. She had just flipped the game. And now, Langston was the one on trial. The truth reveals. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Karoline Leavitt stood firm, her sharp gaze locked on Judge Langston, waiting for him to slip. waiting for a crack to appear in his carefully controlled performance. Then, it happened. A man in the witness section stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. "I can't do this," he muttered. His voice trembled, but there was resolve in his eyes. Everyone turned. The man, mid-50s, graying hair, expensive suit, looked out of place among the other so-called witnesses. Karoline had noticed him before, sitting stiffly, his face drawn. Now, his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Langston's eyes darkened. "Mr. Whitaker, sit down immediately or you will be removed." Whitaker didn't move. He took a breath, then turned to the jury. "This is not a trial," he said, his voice louder this time. "This is a setup." A murmur swept through the room. Langston slammed his gavel. "I will not tolerate disruptions." Whitaker ignored him. Judges like Langston, including Langston, were bribed to push cases like this through. To silence anyone who opposes the religious restrictions being forced onto this country. Gasps. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God." Karoline remained still, letting the moment unfold. Langston's face flushed red. "Remove him from this courtroom, now." Two bailiffs moved forward, grabbing Whitaker by the arms. But it was too late. The seed of truth had been planted. People were watching. People were listening. Karoline slowly picked up her phone from the table, her thumb lightly tapping the screen. The recording was still running. And now, she had exactly what she needed. Public reaction. Karoline Leavitt stepped out of the courthouse, the cool DC air hitting her face as she walked down the marble steps. The moment the heavy doors shut behind her, she pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved swiftly, attaching the audio file she had just recorded. A single message accompanied it. "The trial they didn't want you to know about. The truth, unfiltered. #Phantom Trial." She hit post. Within minutes, the internet erupted. Media firestorm. The first to break the story was independent journalist outlets. Then came Fox News. Fox News headline: "Mysterious Trial. White House muzzling people of faith?" Daily Wire. "Secret Court. Fake charges. Real corruption. Karoline Leavitt exposes rigged system." Social media posts. "This isn't justice. This is a purge. #Phantom Trial." Then came X, formerly Twitter. The hashtag Phantom Trial skyrocketed, trending globally within 3 hours. Conservative leaders chimed in. Members of Congress demanded immediate investigations. Legal analysts debated whether Langston's courtroom was even constitutionally valid. The pressure was mounting. Karoline watched the chaos unfold on her phone, standing beside Michael Carter as notifications flooded in. They tried to bury the truth. Michael muttered, shaking his head. Karoline smirked. And now, the whole world is watching. The battle had just turned public, and there was no stopping it now. The system begins to crack. Washington, D.C., was in chaos. The leaked recording had ignited a firestorm, and the government was scrambling to contain the fallout. But it was too late. The system that had operated in the shadows for years was finally being dragged into the light. Congress takes action. Less than 24 hours after Karoline Leavitt's explosive release, congressional leaders called an emergency session. On the Senate floor, Senator Mark Callaway, a staunch defender of constitutional rights, stood before the cameras. "This is no longer just about Karoline Leavitt," he declared. "This is about the integrity of our justice system. If a federal judge can oversee a secret trial, manipulating the law to silence dissent, then no American is safe." Within hours, Congress passed a resolution establishing an independent investigation into judicial corruption. The new Special Committee on Judicial Oversight was tasked with reviewing all federal cases that showed signs of political manipulation. And the first name on their list? Judge Victor Langston. Langston falls. The Department of Justice wasted no time. By that evening, Judge Langston was placed on immediate suspension pending investigation. His office was sealed. His cases were frozen. His entire career, once untouchable, was now crumbling. Fox News. Judge Langston suspended after explosive trial leak. Is this just the beginning? Daily Wire. Congress opens probe into secret trials, judicial corruption unraveling. X. Twitter. Posts. This is huge. The deep state is finally cracking. #Phantom Trial. Karoline sat in her office, watching the headlines flood in. Michael Carter leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You just took down a federal judge." Karoline exhaled, adjusting the silver cross on her collar. "Good." But she knew, this was just one battle. And the war wasn't over yet. The enemy strikes back. The weight of victory didn't last long. At first, Karoline Leavitt brushed it off as paranoia. A shadow where there shouldn't be one. A car lingering too long outside her office. A vague sense that something was off. But then, the black SUV appeared. It sat across the street from her townhouse. Engine idling, never moving, never leaving, just watching. The first night, she ignored it. The second night, it returned. By the third night, she knew, this wasn't a coincidence. A warning in the dark. It was nearly midnight when her phone buzzed. The screen glowed in the dimly lit bedroom, displaying a message from an unknown number. "You may have won this time, but we won't forget. Be careful." Karoline stared at the words. Her pulse steady, her expression unreadable. They weren't hiding anymore. Michael Carter had warned her. Taking down Langston was one thing, but exposing the whole system? That's another. She exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tighter. They wanted her afraid. They wanted her to second-guess her next move. But they still didn't understand. She wasn't the type to back down. She was the type to strike first. A new step on the front lines of justice. The interview studio was buzzing with energy. The cameras were rolling, the lights were hot, and millions of viewers were waiting for her response. Karoline Leavitt sat across from the anchor. Poised, confident. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind, secret trials, judicial suspensions, and now, threats from the shadows. The host leaned forward. "Miss Leavitt, after everything that has happened, the lawsuit, the corruption exposure, the threats against you, are you afraid?" Karoline didn't hesitate. She let a small smirk curl at the edge of her lips and answered with a single, unwavering statement. "If justice is twisted, I will be the one to turn it right." The interview continued, but that line was all it took. A rallying cry. Within hours, her words spread like wildfire. Fox News. Karoline Leavitt takes a stand. "I will turn justice right." Daily Wire. A new movement is rising, Americans demand accountability. X. Twitter. Posts. "She isn't backing down. Neither should we. Hashtag turn it right." The hashtag turn it right climbed the trending charts, becoming a slogan for a movement demanding real judicial reform. Protests erupted in major cities. Peaceful but powerful, filled with people carrying signs. "We demand truth. No more secret courts. Turn it right." But as the world celebrated her courage, something else was happening behind closed doors. The next battle. That night, back in her office, Karoline sat at her desk, skimming through legal briefings and case updates. The victory against Langston had been monumental, but she knew better than to believe the war was over. Then, she saw it. A plain, manila folder, sitting at the center of her desk. She hadn't put it there. Her pulse quickened as she reached for it, flipping it open. Inside was another case, another name, another scandal, one even deeper and more dangerous than the last. Karoline inhaled slowly. They thought she would stop. But they had just given her a new reason to fight. Open end, a new war begins. The city outside her window was wrapped in darkness. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't sleeping. She sat at her desk, staring at the new file in front of her. The weight of it was unmistakable. The stakes, higher than ever. She had exposed one secret trial. But this was something bigger. Something they would never allow to see the light of day. She picked up her phone and scrolled to a name she could trust. The line rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered. "We have work to do," Karoline said, her grip tightening around the file. She glanced at the silver cross on her blazer, its reflection catching in the dim light. "And this time," she continued, her voice firm, "I will not let them cover it up." Outside, Washington, D.C., lay in silence. But the fight had just begun. And Karoline Leavitt was ready.